All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we are going to meticulously unpack the actual legal machinery behind the high-profile seizures of billionaire mega yachts that have been making headlines since 2022. We've all seen those dramatic news stories, right? Massive floating palaces getting locked down by authorities all over the globe. But you know what? The story of how this is actually done legally is wildly misunderstood. And honestly, the reality is way more fascinating than the fiction. We are going to explain everything in depth today. So let's get into it. So how exactly do you legally seize a billionaire's mega yacht? It's a great question. Most people just assume port inspectors used standard maritime safety laws to lock down these multi-million-dollar vessels. It paints a pretty vivid picture, doesn't it? An inspector struts on board, spots a broken fire extinguisher, and boom, slaps a padlock on the whole ship. But as you'll soon see, the actual legal story is far more fragile, a lot more complex, and rooted in an entirely different set of powers. To give you the full picture, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the great superyacht myth, explain real port state control, uncover the true mechanism, which is sanctions law, look at some vessel spotlights, dive into shell companies in the 2025 legal battles, and wrap up with the blunt power of sovereignty. Okay, part one. The great superyacht myth. So it's widely, and I mean completely incorrectly believed that vessels like the Amadea, the Dilbar, and about 20 others were detained using something called port state control. I mean, if you just read the headlines, you totally think maritime agencies used basic shipping rules to trap these oligarch fleets. But conflating mundane maritime safety with the seizure of $500 million floating palaces, that's going to leave you completely misunderstanding how the law actually works here. Which brings us to part two, real port state control explained. The crucial thing to understand is that port state control is a very specific, really narrow doctrine. It's managed by regional frameworks, like the Paris and Tokyo MOUs, and it's focused purely on safety, pollution, and labor standards. It basically relies on this principle called no more favorable treatment. What does that mean? Well, it ensures that even if a ship is flying a flag of convenience from a country that hasn't signed a treaty, they're still held to the exact same strict standards once they enter a participating port. No loopholes. Genuine port inspectors enforce these strict international conventions on commercial vessels. We're talking about checking fire safety systems and life-saving gear under SOLAS, looking at pollution prevention equipment under MARPOL, and making sure that crew welfare and certifications are up to par under the MLC. It's a real, everyday exercise of maritime regulatory power, purely designed to keep the oceans safe. But, well, here is the catch. A privately owned, non-chartering superyacht, which is exactly what most of these oligarch vessels are, is actually legally exempt from this standard regulatory net. Unless they're engaged in commercial trade, these private pleasure yachts mostly sit entirely outside this core commercial vessel port state control framework. Meaning, the inspectors simply do not have the legal jurisdiction to seize them for geopolitical reasons under those safety laws. No way! So, that takes us to part three, the true mechanism, sanctions law. If it's not maritime safety, what is it? The true legal mechanism isn't maritime law at all. It's actually domestic sanctions law and ordinary territorial sovereignty. This whole thing is really a story about asset forfeiture and economic freezes. Governments are using their own domestic statutes, like the U.S. International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or similar laws in Europe. So it's enforced not by maritime boards, but by a state exercising its everyday sovereign jurisdiction over a physical asset that just happens to be sitting in its port at the time. Let's look at some real-world examples and part four, vessel spotlights. Take the Amadea as a perfect example. We're talking about a $300 million asset here. It was seized in Fiji by the U.S. Task Force Kleptocapture, and a U.S. district court found probable cause for forfeiture. Why? Based on violations of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, money laundering, and conspiracy. The yacht was eventually brought to San Diego, and it was detained strictly based on domestic U.S. economic laws. Not a single maritime safety statute was involved in the whole shebang. It's a similar story with the Amore Vero. It wasn't boarded by port safety inspectors looking for expired flares. It was locked down by French customs authorities. They were directly wielding domestic EU sanctions regulations through their territorial jurisdiction to freeze the asset right then and there. And then you have the Dilbar, literally one of the largest yachts in the entire world. It was restricted from leaving Hamburg by German authorities, who cited sanctions designations against its alleged beneficial owner. The sovereign state simply exercised jurisdiction over a massive physical asset sitting within its borders. To put that into perspective, it's pretty much exactly like how a government could seize a building or freeze a local bank account. Now for Part 5, Shell Companies and the 2025 legal battles. You know, superyacht ownership is almost never straightforward. I mean, you don't just put a 500-foot boat on your personal credit card, right? The ownership is intentionally hidden through complex layers of shell companies and completely obscured blind trusts. This is done precisely to mask the true beneficial owner. Because of this deliberate obfuscation, it's like a giant puzzle. Governments actually have to legally prove who owns the vessel for a sanctions-based seizure to hold up in court. And because of these incredibly complex ownership webs, the legal foundation of these seizures can actually start to crumble. The initial freezes happened way back in February 2022, but live legal battles are actively testing these actions today. For instance, in March 2025, a U.S. federal court had to step in to reject a non-sanctioned Russian businessman's standing to claim the Amedea. And then, literally just a month later, a Frankfurt court ruled against the German government in a major dispute involving the Dilbar's unpaid maintenance costs. Let's look a little closer at that 2025 Dilbar ruling, because it's absolutely crucial to understanding how this whole legal mechanism actually works. In this case, Alisher Osmanev's sister was originally sanctioned as an alleged beneficiary of the trust that owned the yacht, but she was removed from the EU sanctions list in 2025. Because of that change, the Frankfurt court ruled against the government. What does this mean for us? It proves that a sanctions-based seizure is definitely not a permanent, unassailable state. If a sanctions designation lapses or gets defeated in court, the entire seizure can unravel just like that. Part 6, when safety inspections actually apply. Just to be absolutely clear, there is a time when the safety inspections do apply. If a yacht is commercially registered for charter, then it actually does legally enter the standard maritime framework. So if it calls at a Paris MOU or Tokyo MOU port, it will face real safety compliance inspections for things like fire systems and crew welfare under those acronyms we talked about earlier, SOLAS, MARPOL, and the MLC. But remember, this is a completely different, much quieter regulatory power than the massive geopolitical forfeiture battles we've been discussing today. And finally, our conclusion, the blunt power of sovereignty. So what's the big takeaway here? Basically, a yacht's flag and its owner's immense wealth offer far less protection than you might assume. But, and this is key, this isn't because of some overarching international maritime law. It is entirely because of the blunt force of territorial sovereignty. A state's ordinary territorial jurisdiction over absolutely anything physically sitting in its ports is an incredibly powerful tool. It completely replaces that myth of the maritime safety inspector shutting things down. This whole situation leaves us with a fascinating, unresolved mystery to ponder. Think about it. If seizing a multi-hundred-million-dollar asset depends entirely on a fragile sanctions designation actually holding up in court, are any of these seizures truly permanent? We've already seen how easily these legal foundations can be challenged once the political dust starts to settle. It is a really striking reminder of both the limits and the immense power of domestic law playing out on the international stage.